there's a good book that I would recommend reading called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. It's a new book, relatively new book, and he details out the ineradicability of inequality. So part of the problem with this process that we just described, where success breeds success and failure breeds failure, is that the people who are succeeding get a disproportionate share of the resource pie, let's say. So, everyone knows that about money, right? Because the 12 richest people in the world, the 85 richest people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2 billion, which seems, well, let's say unfair. Now, it's certainly unequal. Now, whether it's unfair is slightly different.
The statistic is the eight richest have equal to the bottom 3.5 billion.
Yeah, well, it's probably worse than it was when I looked at this about 3 years ago. So, but it doesn't matter, because you get the point. But
it's crazy.
But the thing is that this is not something that only applies to money. It applies to everything that's creatively produced. So the same rule applies to number of records sold by recording artists. The same rule applies to number of books sold by novelists. The same rule applies to number of goals scored by NHL hockey players. The same rule applies to the population of cities and the mass of stars and the size of trees in the jungle. It's like the inequality problem is way more troublesome, again, than mere capitalism. It's a terrible problem. And Scheidel's work, which is really, really interesting, he's traced back inequality 15,000 years. You can do it, for example, let's say you find a Neolithic burial site and there's 200 people in it. So these people would be buried with their possessions. And obviously some of them decay, but some of them don't. And like some of them are buried with gold. Well, hardly any of them. And the tiny proportion of people who are buried with gold are buried with a lot of gold. So you can even derive a Gini coefficient estimate, which is an estimate of inequality from burial sites. And it looks like as soon as you get a surplus, you get inequality. And that's a rough thing, because you might think, well, even in hunter-gatherer societies where there's no surplus, there's still inequality, because there's inequality of friendship, there's inequality of health, and there's inequality of sexual access. And those things are not trivial. But when you're thinking about it purely economically, you start to get inequality as soon as you get a surplus. You think, oh, that's interesting. So there's a natural rule, which is surplus generates inequality. All right, so how do you solve that? And Scheidel's book says, well, that's easy. You just get rid of the surplus. Right, and that's not good. So like he found, and so one of the things he did was statistical analysis, because one of the things you might ask is, well, let's say you have your measures of inequality, and then you can track them around the world, and you can track whether or not the inequality is generated by a right-wing government or a left-wing government. And then you might hope, well, the left-wing governments would ameliorate inequality. There's no evidence for that at all. It doesn't look like inequality is it doesn't look like the amelioration of inequality is within the purview of political organization. Yeah. And you should not hear that with any degree of happiness whatsoever, because the social science on inequality is also clear. As inequality levels increase, societies destabilize. And the best indicator of that, I already mentioned that was work that was done by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson at McMaster University in Canada. They're really interested in what drove male homicide, because most homicide is male on male. It's mostly young males. It's mostly within race, and it's mostly status competition, right? So, and the status competitions get intense where inequality increases. So where everyone's poor, so if you rank order American states and Canadian provinces by inequality, the poorer provinces where everyone's poor, there's no male aggression. And the rich provinces and states where everyone's rich, there's no male homicide. But the states and provinces where inequality is high, the male homicide rate starts to climb up. And it's probably the most aggressive males who get most aggressive most rapidly when inequality increases. So there's a psychological component, but inequality drives male homicide. 0.9 is the correlation, which means that you actually don't need any other explanation for male homicide. Maybe you throw in alcohol, just as an extraneous variable. You don't need any other explanation for the male homicide rate than inequality. It's staggering work. It's absolutely staggering work. And so the thing is that a meritocracy will drive inequality. And then you have a problem because people stack up at zero and they can't get out of zero, because that's what happens as inequality increases. People think about when you're playing Monopoly, the game. I mean, that's a perfect example of how inequality emerges. Everybody's equal to begin with. Everybody basically plays a random game, because Monopoly is basically a random game. I mean, there's some skill in it, but not much. So it's a random game. So what happens when everyone starts equal and you play a random game? One person ends up with everything. Everyone else stacks up at 0. Now, Scheidele's book basically shows the only way out of that is various forms of war, including revolution, and epidemics. That's it. That's the only thing he's been able to track. That, and what happens is, well, you level everyone, and then inequality decreases. It's like, well...
Not only are the solutions that Marxism offers error-ridden, to say the least, given the historical evidence, and I just don't see how anybody can deny that, although people certainly do, but that the problem that the Marxists originally identified seems actually to be vanishing. I mean, as you already pointed out, there's been an unparalleled increase in material prosperity among, not only among the rich, which you could complain about if you were concerned about inequality, but among the poorest people in the world. Like, we have absolute material privation based on UN standards by 50% between the year 2000 and 2012. The cynics say that's because we set the standard for material privation too low, which is $1.90 a day. But if you look at the curves that you can generate at levels of $3.80 a day or $7.60 a day, you see exactly the same thing happening. And you see rapid increases in economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa, like 7% growth rates, which are more typically characteristic, say, of China or India, and that's manifested in unbelievably positive statistical evidence, such as that suggesting that now the child mortality rate in Africa is the same as it was in Europe in 1952. So the Marxists' original complaint was that the rich were going to get richer and the poor were going to get poorer, and that could be laid at the feet of capitalism, just like the fact of hierarchy itself could be laid at the feet of capitalism. And it's clear that capitalism, although it does produce hierarchical inequality, just like every other system that we know of, it also produces wealth, and that wealth is actually being very effectively distributed to the people, perhaps not primarily to the people who most need it, but to the people who most need it in ways that are truly mattering. And so, to me, the entire structure of Marxism is anachronistic. The problem is no longer appropriately formulated, and the solution tends to be deadly, if counterproductive, if not deadly. So it's maybe here's something I've been thinking about too. You could tell me what you think about this. Some of it still has to do with the innate human emotional response to inequality. When you walk down the street and you see a ruined alcoholic schizophrenic who's obviously suffering in 50 different dimensions, it's very difficult to feel positive about the state of humanity in the world. And it's very easy for a reflexive compassion to take over and say, well, wouldn't it be something if we could just retool society so that none of that was necessary? It must be someone's fault. It must be something that we're not doing right. And, there's some truth in that, because of course our systems could be better than they are. And it seems to me to be that unreflexive compassion that drives whatever residual attractiveness that Marxism still has, apart also from the darker possibility, which is that it really does appeal to the jealousy that's characteristic of people, and the envy, and which manifests itself as hatred for hierarchy on the basis that some people are doing better than me.